Be careful who you try to humiliate in public. You might be handing them the stage. The crystal chandelier above the Whitmore Grand Dining Hall shimmered like a crown of cold fire, scattering light across polished marble floors and glasses of vintage Bordeaux that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and at the center of it all sat Amara Hayes, perfectly still, her spine straight, her hands resting lightly beside a delicate gold ring that no longer felt like a promise but a memory she had already outgrown, while across from her, Daniel Whitmore, billionaire, CEO, and the man the room revolved around, leaned back in his chair with effortless authority, his tailored tuxedo catching the light just enough to remind everyone exactly who he believed he was, the king of this empire, the architect of every success in the room, the man whose approval could elevate or erase careers with a single nod. And tonight, as laughter drifted through the air like soft background music, he was performing, not for Amara, but for the investors seated along the table, for the woman to his right whose polished smile mirrored ambition more than warmth, for the audience that mattered, and Amara, dressed in a sleek black gown that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, had become nothing more than a shadow in his carefully curated world, a presence acknowledged only when convenient, dismissed when necessary, and as the conversation turned toward acquisitions and expansion, Daniel's voice cut through the room with practiced ease, smooth and confident, each word measured like a man who had never once doubted his place at the top. Some people, he said with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, inherit opportunity without understanding how to handle it, a subtle pause, just long enough for the implication to settle, his gaze flicking briefly toward Amara, then away again as if she were an afterthought, a decorative detail rather than a partner, and the table responded exactly as expected, a ripple of polite laughter, a few knowing nods, the kind of reaction that fed his control, that reinforced the illusion that he owned not just the company, but the narrative, and Amara did not react, not when the laughter grew, not when the woman beside him leaned in closer as if she belonged there more than the wife he had chosen, not when the weight of 100 unspoken judgments pressed quietly against her shoulders, because Amara Hayes had learned something far more powerful than reacting. She had learned how to wait, her gaze drifting for a moment to the reflection in her glass. The chandelier fractured into 1,000 tiny lights, each one sharp, precise, controlled, and for just a second, her fingers brushed the edge of her ring, not clinging to it, not adjusting it, just acknowledging it, like closing a chapter no one else in the room even knew had already ended, and beneath the table, her phone vibrated once, subtle, almost imperceptible, a single message lighting up the screen before fading back into darkness, 3 words she didn't need to read twice, board is ready. She didn't reach for it, didn't break the rhythm of the evening, because timing was everything, and Daniel was still talking, still smiling, still believing that this dinner was his stage, that this room existed to validate him, that the woman sitting across from him was still part of his story, but what he didn't understand, what none of them understood yet, was that the script had already changed, and Amara was no longer playing the role he had written for her. The laughter lingered just a second too long, like a note played past its welcome, and Daniel let it breathe, his fingers tapping lightly against the stem of his glass as if he were conducting the room itself, each reaction feeding the quiet satisfaction behind his composed expression, because control was not something he displayed loudly, it was something he curated, layered into every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word, and tonight he was in full command, or at least that was what everyone believed, including the investors seated along the table who leaned in just enough to signal their alignment, their approval, their willingness to orbit around his gravity, while Amara remained still, her presence calm in a way that did not match the subtle shift in energy beginning to ripple beneath the surface, a shift so quiet it could only be felt, not seen, like the moment before a storm changes direction, and across from her Daniel continued, his tone smooth, almost amused now. In this business, perception is everything, he said, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, watching the way it caught the light, and unfortunately, not everyone understands how to represent the brand at the level it deserves. Another pause. Softer this time, more intimate, designed to sound like insight rather than insult, yet the implication landed exactly where he intended it to, a quiet tightening around the table, a flicker of glances exchanged between those who understood and those who pretended to, and once again his eyes brushed past Amara, dismissive, effortless, as if she were simply part of the decor, a placeholder in a life he had already outgrown. But what Daniel did not notice was the way the room had begun to subtly reorient, not toward him, but toward something unseen, something approaching, because the doors at the far end of the dining hall had opened just slightly, not enough to interrupt, not enough to draw attention, but enough for a single figure to step inside with the kind of quiet authority that did not need announcement. A man in a tailored navy suit, his posture precise, his presence deliberate, pausing just long enough to assess the room before moving forward with measured steps that seemed to echo louder than they should against the polished floor. And Amara saw him, of course she did, her gaze lifting for the briefest second before returning to the table, her expression unchanged, but something behind her eyes sharpening, focusing, aligning, while Daniel continued speaking, unaware, building his narrative higher, stronger, more confident. "We are entering a new phase of leadership," he added, his voice carrying just enough weight to suggest finality, one that requires clarity, precision, and the ability to make difficult decisions without emotional interference. And there it was, the final layer, the justification, the subtle framing of what he was about to do, because humiliation, when wrapped in the language of strategy, sounded almost reasonable, almost necessary, and a few heads nodded again, slower this time, more cautious, as if sensing the edge beneath his words, while the man in the navy suit reached the edge of the table and stopped, not speaking, not interrupting, simply waiting, his presence now impossible to ignore, a quiet disruption in the carefully controlled atmosphere. And for the first time that evening, Daniel's rhythm faltered, just slightly, just enough for a fraction of a second to pass without his voice filling the space. And in that silence, Amara finally moved, not dramatically, not with force, but with intention, her hand lifting to rest gently over the ring before sliding it off her finger with a smooth, unhurried motion, placing it on the table beside her glass as if it weighed nothing at all. And when she looked up this time, she did not look at Daniel the way she had before. There was no hesitation, no softness, only clarity, the kind that does not ask for permission, and the air in the room shifted completely, though no one could yet explain why, only that something had changed, something irreversible, and Daniel, still unaware of the full weight of what was unfolding, offered a small, polite smile toward the unexpected guest at the table, his voice returning, controlled but edged now with curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if he were still the one in charge, as if the night still belonged to him. But the man did not answer him, not immediately, because his attention was not on Daniel at all, it was on Amara, and the room, for the first time, followed that gaze. The silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, as if the entire room had been paused by an invisible hand, and in that suspended moment, the man in the navy suit inclined his head slightly toward Amara, not as an employee acknowledging a superior, but as a professional recognizing authority. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably aligned with her. "Miss Hayes, the board has completed the vote," he said, each word placed with precision, carrying far more weight than its volume suggested, and a subtle shift moved through the table, a ripple of confusion that did not yet have language, because the title did not match the narrative they had been watching all evening, and Daniel's smile tightened just slightly, the kind of expression that held for appearances but cracked beneath scrutiny. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he interjected smoothly, his tone still controlled, still confident, as if this were merely a minor disruption he would resolve in seconds. But the man did not look at him, did not acknowledge him, because his attention remained fixed on Amara, and she, for the first time that night, allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch her lips, not warm, not triumphant, simply certain, and she reached for her glass, lifting it slowly, the crystal catching the chandelier light as she spoke, her voice even, composed, and entirely unhurried. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson," she said, acknowledging him not as a stranger, but as someone expected, someone whose presence had always been part of the evening. And Daniel's fingers stilled against the table, the subtle rhythm he had maintained now gone, replaced by something quieter, sharper, uncertainty beginning to press against the edges of his control. "Amara," he said, her name carrying a warning now, softer but more pointed. "What is this?" And for a brief moment, she looked at him, really looked at him, not as his wife, not as the woman who had once waited for his approval, but as someone evaluating a situation that had already reached its conclusion. And there was no anger in her gaze, no lingering hurt, only clarity, the kind that comes after every illusion has already been dismantled. "This," she replied, her tone steady, "is where perception ends," and the words settled into the room with quiet authority, heavier than anything Daniel had said all night, because they did not ask for agreement, they did not seek validation, they simply existed as fact. And Mr. Lawson stepped forward then, placing a slim leather folder on the table with careful precision, turning it so it faced the center, the documents inside barely visible but undeniably official, and the movement drew every eye, pulling attention away from Daniel in a way that had never happened before, because power, real power, does not announce itself loudly, it shifts direction, and suddenly everyone feels it, even before they understand it, and Amara set her glass down gently, her fingers no longer adorned with the ring that had once symbolized her place beside him, and instead resting lightly against the table as she continued, effective immediately, she said, her voice still calm, still measured. The board has confirmed a majority shareholder transition, and the words landed with a precision that cut through the room, because they were not dramatic, not exaggerated, just exact, and Daniel leaned forward now, the first real break in his composure, his eyes flicking to the folder, then back to her, searching for something he could still control, something he could still redefine. That is not possible, he said, the confidence still present but thinner now, stretched. I hold controlling interest. And for the first time, Amara's smile became visible. Not wide, not mocking, just present. You held it, she corrected softly, and then, with the same calm certainty that had defined her all evening, she added, until I bought it. The room did not erupt, there were no gasps, no sudden reactions, only a collective stillness, the kind that comes when reality rearranges itself in real time, and Daniel did not move, did not speak, because in that single sentence, the entire structure he had built his identity on shifted beneath him, and the chandelier above continued to shimmer, unchanged, its light reflecting now not on the man who believed he owned everything, but on the woman who had quietly taken it all back. The words did not echo, yet they filled every corner of the room, settling into the polished wood, the crystal glass, the carefully constructed identities of everyone seated at that table, and for a moment no one moved, because understanding takes time when reality shifts without warning, and Daniel Whitmore, who had spent his entire career mastering control, found himself caught in the one situation he had never prepared for, a moment where authority did not respond to him, did not bend, did not wait for his command, and his gaze dropped to the folder as if it might correct itself under pressure, as if numbers and signatures could be undone by disbelief alone, but they did not move, they did not change, they simply existed, undeniable, and his hand reached toward it, slower than expected, less certain than he would have allowed anyone to see even minutes ago, and when his fingers touched the edge of the document, it was not power he felt, it was weight, the kind that settles when something long assumed is quietly taken away. This is not finalized, he said, his voice still measured, still attempting to anchor the room back to him, but there was a fracture now, small, almost invisible, yet present, and Mr. Lawson responded before Amara needed to, his tone professional, unwavering. It was finalized at 4:30 this afternoon, Eastern Time, he said, each word precise, leaving no space for reinterpretation, and the timestamp itself seemed to carry a quiet elegance, because while Daniel had been preparing this dinner, crafting his performance, believing he controlled the narrative, the real decision had already been made, elsewhere, beyond his reach, beyond his awareness, and that realization settled in slowly, like a shadow stretching across the table, and for the first time, Daniel looked at Amara not with dismissal, not with superiority, but with something else, something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time, and she met that gaze without hesitation. Without softness, not cruel, not vindictive, simply resolved. You built a company, she said calmly, her voice steady in a way that required no elevation, but you never understood who was holding it together, and the sentence did not accuse, it clarified, and around them the investors remained silent, their attention no longer divided, no longer loyal to the loudest voice, but drawn to the one that required none, and the woman seated beside Daniel shifted slightly, her confidence faltering, her earlier smile fading into something uncertain, because proximity to power only feels secure when that power is stable, and this was not stability, this was transition, and Daniel straightened in his chair, instinctively attempting to reclaim posture, presence, something familiar. You expect me to believe, he began, but the sentence did not finish the way he intended, because even as he spoke it, he understood that belief was no longer the issue, the documents were there, the board had spoken, the alignment had shifted, and Amara did not interrupt him, did not rush the moment, because she did not need to. The silence itself was doing the work, and she reached for the folder, opening it just enough to reveal the signatures, the percentages, the structure that had quietly rewritten the foundation beneath him, then closed it again with the same calm precision, as if the details no longer needed display, because the truth had already been established. "I do not expect you to believe," she said softly. "I expect you to understand." And that was the difference. Belief leaves room for denial, understanding does not. And the chandelier above continued to cast its steady light. Unchanged, indifferent, illuminating a room where power had not been lost, but transferred, not loudly, not violently, but with the kind of quiet certainty that leaves no path back to what was. Daniel did not reach for his glass this time, did not adjust his cufflinks or lean back into the posture that had once defined him, because those habits belonged to a version of control that no longer applied, and instead he sat there, still, his eyes fixed on Amara as if searching for the moment he had missed, the exact second where everything had shifted without his permission, and in that search there was something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to doubt, while around the table the silence began to take on a new shape, no longer uncertain but observant, the kind of silence that waits to see who will speak next, who will define what this moment becomes, and for the first time that evening, no one was looking to Daniel for that answer, their attention remained on her, steady, expectant, because power had a way of redirecting focus without asking, and Amara felt it, not as pressure, not as triumph, but as alignment, as if every piece had finally settled into the position it was always meant to hold, and she lifted her hands slightly, not to command, not to demand, but simply to acknowledge the shift, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table where her ring no longer sat, and when she spoke again, her voice did not rise, did not harden, it remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, calm, precise, undeniable. "This company was never about ownership on paper," she said, her gaze moving briefly across the investors, meeting each pair of eyes without hesitation. "It was about who understood its value, who protected it when it was fragile, and who built its future when no one was watching," and the words did not accuse him directly, they did not need to, because their truth carried its own weight, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. Because somewhere beneath the disbelief, beneath the instinct to resist, he understood what she was saying, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to feel the shift within himself, and Mr. Lawson stepped back then, his role complete, leaving the space open for what came next, and Amara allowed a brief pause, not to create drama, but to let the room absorb what had already been decided, because this was not a reveal meant to shock, it was a reality meant to settle, and she turned her attention back to Daniel, not as his wife, not as someone seeking acknowledgement, but as someone addressing a colleague whose position had changed. "You build visibility," she continued, her tone even. "But you confused attention with control," and that distinction landed quietly, more precise than any confrontation could have been, because it reframed everything he had relied on, every assumption he had made about his place in the company, in the room, in their relationship, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the first sign that he was no longer performing, no longer speaking for the room, but for himself. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the polished edge it had carried. "Before, you did this without telling me," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization, and Amara did not look away, did not soften the answer. "I did this without needing your permission," she replied, and the distinction between the two sentences settled into the space between them, one rooted in expectation, the other in independence, and around them, the investors began to shift subtly, not physically, but in alignment, their posture, their attention, their quiet recalibration toward the direction of certainty, and Daniel saw it, felt it, the way influence moves when it no longer belongs to you, and for a moment, just a moment, the room reflected him not as the man who commanded it, but as the man who had lost it, and Amara reached for her glass once more, lifting it with the same controlled grace, her eyes steady, her presence unshaken. And in that simple motion there was no need for declaration, no need for finality spoken aloud, because everything that needed to be understood had already been placed on the table, clear, complete, and irreversible. The glass hovered for a moment before Amara set it back down, the soft contact against the table almost inaudible, yet it seemed to mark the end of something far larger than the sound itself, and Daniel watched that motion with a focus that had nothing to do with the object in her hand and everything to do with what it represented. Because for the first time he understood that nothing she had done tonight was reaction. Nothing had been impulsive, every word, every pause, every silence had been deliberate, and that realization settled into him with a weight that no argument could lift, while around them the investors began to adjust, not abruptly, not in any way that would draw attention, but subtly, the kind of shift that happens when allegiance moves from one center of gravity to another, and the woman seated beside him leaned back slightly, creating a small but unmistakable distance, as if proximity itself had become uncertain, and Daniel noticed. Of course he did, because control had always meant awareness, and now that awareness was showing him something he had never had to confront before, that influence is not permanent, that respect is not guaranteed, and that position, no matter how carefully built, can change without warning when its foundation is misunderstood. And he straightened again, not out of confidence this time, but out of instinct, trying to find something familiar in a moment that refused to offer it. If this is some kind of strategy, he said slowly, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance, then it is a reckless one, and the words sounded different in the air, less like a command and more like an attempt to regain footing. But Amara did not respond immediately, because she no longer needed to match his timing, she no longer needed to engage on his terms, and when she finally spoke, her tone remained unchanged, steady, composed, untouched by the tension that had begun to define the room. It is not a strategy, she said, her gaze steady on him, it is a correction, and the distinction settled between them with quiet finality, because a strategy can be debated, can be challenged, can be undone, but a correction simply acknowledges what should have been clear all along. And Daniel's expression shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not watching closely, but enough for the truth to begin pressing through the layers of control he had relied on, and he glanced once more at the folder, then at the faces around the table, searching, measuring, recalculating, and what he found was not resistance, not immediate support, but something far more telling, neutrality, the kind that waits to see where stability will land before committing, and that, more than anything, confirmed what he had been resisting, that this moment was not temporary, that it was not a misstep or a misunderstanding, but a transition already accepted by those who mattered most, and Amara observed all of it without comment, because she did not need to narrate what was already unfolding, and she reached forward slightly, adjusting the folder by a fraction of an inch, aligning it with the edge of the table as if restoring order to something that had been misaligned for far too long, and then she leaned back, not in retreat, but in completion. Her posture relaxed in a way that did not diminish her presence, but clarified it, and when she spoke again, her voice carried no edge, no triumph, only truth. You wanted to make a statement tonight, she said, her words precise, measured, and you did. A brief pause, just enough to let the meaning settle, just not the one you planned, and the sentence did not strike like an attack, it landed like a conclusion, the final line of a narrative that had already reached its end, and Daniel did not respond, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to redefine, only the quiet, undeniable understanding that the room, the company, and the story he believed he controlled had moved beyond him, and for the first time, he was not the one deciding what happened next. No one reached for their glass anymore, no one checked their phone, no one attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground, because the room had crossed a line that could not be undone, and now it waited, not for permission, but for resolution, and Daniel felt it, the stillness pressing in from every direction, not hostile, not aggressive, just present, the kind of silence that reveals more than noise ever could, and for a moment he remained where he was, his hands resting on the table. His posture held together by habit rather than certainty, as if he were deciding whether to speak again or accept what had already been said, and in that hesitation, something within him shifted, something quieter than defeat, something closer to awareness, and when he finally looked at Amara again, it was not with the dismissiveness that had defined the beginning of the evening, but with a clarity that had arrived too late to change anything. When did you decide? He asked, his voice low, stripped of performance, and the question did not challenge her, it acknowledged her, and Amara regarded him for a brief moment, not surprised by the question, not moved by it either, simply recognizing it for what it was, an attempt to understand a timeline that no longer belonged to him. The moment I realized you thought I needed your approval to exist in my own life, she answered, her tone steady, not sharp, not emotional, just precise, and the words did not accuse, they illuminated, drawing a line between what had been assumed and what had always been true, and Daniel absorbed that in silence, because there was no immediate response that could hold against it, and around them, the investors exchanged subtle glances, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to signal that the center of gravity had fully shifted, that the future of the company was no longer a question of personality or presence, but of direction, and Amara was the one providing it, and she sensed it, not as validation, but as confirmation, and she turned her attention briefly toward them, her gaze composed, acknowledging their presence. Without seeking their reaction, "We will be scheduling a full board meeting tomorrow morning," she said, her voice carrying just enough to include everyone at the table, 10 o'clock, Eastern Time, to discuss the next phase of leadership and operational restructuring, and the statement was not framed as a suggestion, not presented as an idea. It was a decision, already set in motion, and the clarity of it settled the room further, because certainty has a way of calming uncertainty, even when it changes everything. And one of the investors gave a slight nod, then another, the movement subtle but unmistakable, alignment forming not through persuasion, but through recognition of stability, and Daniel watched it happen in real time, the quiet agreement, the subtle acceptance, the way influence moved without announcement, and he understood now, more than he had at any point before, that this was not about losing a position, it was about losing a narrative he had mistaken for truth, and Amara returned her attention to him one last time, not to continue the conversation, but to close it, her expression composed, her presence unchanged. "You built something visible," she said, her voice calm, "but visibility does not equal ownership," and the sentence settled between them like a final note, not meant to linger, but to define, and she rose then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with the same controlled grace that had carried her through the entire evening, her chair sliding back with a soft, almost inaudible sound. And as she stood, the room responded without being asked, a subtle straightening, a shift in posture, attention following her not out of obligation, but out of recognition, and she did not look back immediately, did not seek confirmation, because she already had it, and when she finally turned, it was not to reclaim anything, but to leave it behind, her gaze passing over the table once more before settling briefly on Daniel, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more final, understanding. The kind that comes when there is nothing left to prove. And then she stepped away, her heels quiet against the marble floor, moving through the light that had once belonged to him, carrying it with her without effort, while Daniel remained seated, still, silent, and for the first time in a long time, no one was waiting for him to speak. The sound of her heels faded into the distance with quiet precision, each step measured, unhurried, as if she had nowhere to rush to because everything she had come for had already been completed. And the doors at the far end of the dining hall opened just enough to let her pass through before closing again with a softness that contrasted the weight of what she left behind, and for several seconds after she disappeared, no one spoke, because the absence she created was louder than her presence had been, and Daniel remained seated exactly where she had left him, his gaze fixed on the space she had occupied, as if expecting something to return, some version of the evening to rewind itself into familiarity, but nothing moved. Nothing shifted back. The room had already accepted its new alignment, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to reassemble itself, not around him, but around what came next, and one of the investors cleared his throat softly, not to break the silence, but to navigate it. "We will need to review the transition documents," he said carefully, his tone neutral, professional, as if this were simply another development in a business cycle, not a moment that had just redefined the entire structure of leadership. And another voice followed, quieter but aligned, agreed, and the conversation, fragile at first, began to take shape again, not centered on Daniel, not waiting for his direction, but moving independently, guided by the clarity that had been established in her absence, and Daniel heard it, every word, every shift, every subtle confirmation that the room no longer required him to function, and his hand finally moved, reaching for the glass in front of him, not out of habit this time, but as if testing whether something remained within his control, and the wine caught the light just as it had before, unchanged, indifferent, and he held it there for a moment before setting it down again without taking a sip, because even that felt unnecessary now, and he leaned back slightly, not with authority, but with a kind of stillness that comes when there is nothing left to perform, and across the table, Mr. Lawson remained standing, his presence calm, waiting not for instruction from Daniel, but for the next directive that would come from the person who now held it. And Daniel noticed that too, the subtle but absolute shift in who the room responded to, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his expression, not anger, not resentment, but recognition, the kind that arrives when denial no longer serves any purpose, and he glanced once more at the folder, the clean lines of the document, the signatures that had already rewritten his position, and he understood then that this was not a moment he could recover from with words, not something he could negotiate back into place. Because the decision had not been made in this room. It had simply been revealed here, and the realization settled into him quietly, without resistance, without argument, just fact, and around him, the conversation continued to rebuild, structured, efficient, already adapting to the direction she had set, and Daniel, for the first time, was not part of it, not because he had been removed, but because the center had moved beyond him, and as the chandelier above continued to cast its steady light across the table, reflecting off glass and polished surfaces, it illuminated a man who had once defined the room, now sitting within it as something else entirely, not erased, not diminished, but no longer the axis around which everything turned, and in that stillness, with voices continuing just beyond his reach, Daniel Whitmore finally understood the difference between being seen and truly being in control, and how easily one can be mistaken for the other until the moment it disappears. Outside, the night air carried a quiet coolness that felt almost unfamiliar after the controlled warmth of the dining hall, and Amara stepped onto the marble terrace without slowing, the city stretching before her in a grid of light and motion, every building illuminated with the quiet persistence of a world that never paused for any single story, and she stopped just once, not to look back, not to reconsider, but simply to breathe, her shoulders settling into a stillness that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with completion, because what had happened inside was never about proving anything to anyone. It was about ending something that had already lost its truth long before this night began, and the faint reflection of the chandelier still lingered in the glass doors behind her, now distant, now irrelevant, while inside, Daniel Whitmore remained seated in a room that no longer belonged to him in the way he once believed, and though the conversation had resumed, though decisions were already being discussed in structured tones and measured language, there was a quiet awareness beneath it all, a recognition that something irreversible had taken place, something that could not be undone by strategy or influence, and Daniel listened, not as the leader he had always been, but as someone observing a system continue without his direction, and that realization settled deeper with each passing second, not sharp, not sudden, but steady, like a truth that had been waiting to surface, and he finally rose, not to reclaim the room, not to interrupt what was unfolding, but because remaining seated no longer made sense, his chair sliding back with a soft sound that drew a brief glance or two before attention returned to the table, and he adjusted his jacket out of habit, though the gesture felt different now, less like preparation and more like closure, and as he stepped away, the folder remained exactly where it had been placed, aligned, complete, no longer something he needed to reach for, because its meaning had already been understood. And when he reached the doors, he paused for just a fraction of a second, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, not distorted, not diminished, simply changed, and beyond it, he could see her, standing at the edge of the terrace, her silhouette framed by the city lights, steady, composed, entirely separate from the world he had once assumed they shared, and for a moment he considered stepping forward, saying something, anything that might reshape what had just occurred, but the thought did not move him, because even he understood now that there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to redefine, and so he remained where he was, the distance between them small in space but absolute in meaning, and outside, Amara did not turn, did not acknowledge his presence behind her, because she did not need to. The conversation between them had already reached its end, and after a moment, she began to walk again, not quickly, not slowly, just forward. Her steps carrying her into a future that no longer required explanation, while behind her, the doors closed once more, soft, final, and inside, the room continued without pause, adjusting, evolving, moving toward the direction she had already set, and Daniel stood there in the quiet that followed, understanding at last that power is not what you display in a room, but what remains when you leave it, and she had taken all of it with her.